Is this Mary Magdalene seated at Jesus' right-hand side in Da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper? Was Mary Jesus' wife and the mother of his child? Was Mary indeed the Holy Grail? Well, that's the romantic story you'll find in Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code, the best-selling thriller that's raised many eyebrows and questions. Maybe Dan Brown has touched a nerve by presenting a powerful female figure in Mary Magdalene. The novel is a great catalyst for discussion about Mary, Jesus, and women in the church. The whole notion of the sacred feminine raises questions about how the church has treated women throughout history.
We just got the results back from the lab, and I don't know how much time she has left.
I wish to confess. I've done lots of bad things, but I guess the point today, I don't really have anything to confess. I mean, maybe some other day, but what I want to confess today is that I think that you're my father.
Yes, I'm Father David.
No, I don't mean as in a priest father. I mean, I think you're my actual father.
What?
I think I'm your daughter.
Behind me here is the Church of Mary Magdalene, built on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. It was actually built by Alexander III and dedicated to the memory of his mother, Maria. It's probably one of Jerusalem's most distinctive pieces of architecture, and perhaps the most conspicuous house of worship in the whole of Jerusalem. And it shows how revered Mary Magdalene was held in the early Christian church. But before we talk about Mary Magdalene, let's talk about what life was like for women in the first century at the time of Jesus.
Women in first century Judaism had substantial leadership roles in the synagogue. They had substantial roles in the temple in Jerusalem. They appeared in public. They owned homes. They had their own money. So women joined the Jesus movement and followed Jesus, not because they were women and they were oppressed because they were women. They joined the movement for the same reason that their fathers and their sons and their brothers and their husbands did. It was because Jesus' message was sufficiently compelling that they were willing to give up what they had and follow him.
Mary Magdalene got her name from the little village of Magdala that was once situated here on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. The Gospel of Luke says that she was a sinner whose life was completely turned around by Jesus.
The Gospels record that she was a sinner. The Gospel of Luke tells us that she was possessed by 7 demons. Obviously, there was a great change that took place in her life. And by the way that she shows her gratitude to Jesus, it's clear that Jesus made a big difference in her life.
It's very clear that the spiritual part of her life is important to her, and that once Jesus exorcises the demons out of her life, she's going to be his follower.
Mary is one of a small group of women who are among Jesus' closest followers, including the disciples.
She appears only once during Jesus' entire public ministry prior to his last hours. She appears, this one time she appears is in Luke chapter 8, where she's named with two other women, Joanna and Susanna. These three women accompany Jesus and his disciples on some of their travels and provide them with the financial means that they need to survive. And so she's not isolated off as somebody particularly special to Jesus. She just happens to be one of the women accompanying Jesus and his followers.
We find women who are patronesses of Jesus, who are disciples of Jesus, who travel together with the apostles, and are consistent witnesses of the most important aspects of his ministry, his passion, death, and resurrection. Women form part of the key community in Jerusalem after the Ascension, throughout Pentecost, and continue to play important roles because they're arrested in Acts chapter 8 as part of the leadership of the church.
In the first century, for someone to be fraternizing with women, like Jesus is said to have done, to be sitting alone with women whom he didn't know, is extraordinary. And it shows that his approach to women, his judgment of women and men, was in that respect not differentiated at all.
The strongest evidence of Mary's close relationship with Jesus is the fact that all the texts picture Mary as being the first witness to the resurrection. I'm here at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where many believe that Jesus was crucified. Not only was Mary the first witness to the resurrection, but she stayed there the longest of all the disciples. Mary returned the next day with Mary, the mother of James, and Salome to anoint the body of Jesus. When they arrived, the tomb was empty. The body was gone. Then very early Sunday morning, Mary was the first witness to the resurrection.
Jesus appears to her at the tomb in the garden, and he says, "Go and tell my brethren that I have risen." The text then says that Mary Magdalene goes and she says to them, "I have seen the Lord, and these are the things he told me." That scene very early gave rise to the tradition that Mary was indeed an apostle. She was commissioned by the risen Jesus to go and tell the word, and that's the qualification for an apostle.
If she's the first to proclaim Jesus was raised from the dead, you could make the argument she's the one who started Christianity. If Christianity is the belief in Jesus' death and resurrection, and she's the first one to proclaim it, well, she would have started the entire religion, which means she'd be hugely important.
There are only a dozen or so references to Mary in the Bible. Author Dan Brown, in his novel, The Da Vinci Code, has used a great deal of literary license to fill in the gaps about Mary and Jesus' relationship. Let's start with the big one. The central controversy in the Da Vinci Code is that Mary and Jesus were married and had a child whose descendants are still alive today. Now, the main characters unravel the church's conspiracy to cover up that Mary herself was the Holy Grail. Fact or fiction? Let's take a look at the evidence.
Dan Brown claims that the source for the idea that Jesus and Mary were married comes from the Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels are that set of 52 philosophical and religious texts that were discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945. The texts are controversial, and many scholars have rejected them outright. Writers such as Dan Brown and others before him have drawn on these texts to embellish a physical relationship between Jesus and Mary.
In the Gospel of Philip, there is a passage that says that Jesus loved Mary. It just says Mary. We think this is Mary Magdalene. That Jesus loved Mary a great deal and kissed her on the... and the word is missing in the manuscript.
There is a tear in the manuscript of the Gospel of Philip, and the word for where he kissed her is missing. Now, the standard guess is that it's on the lips, but it could have been on the elbow. The word is not there. So it is possible, but it is not provable, that Jesus is thought by the Gospel of Philip, 3rd century document that may have had no historical evidence to base it on, that Jesus used to kiss her and that the other disciples were envious of her closeness. In the Da Vinci Code, we're told by Sir Lee Teabing that the Aramaic term actually means spouse. Pity the Gospel of Philip isn't written in Aramaic.
Most Gnostics were profoundly ascetic. So as far as the Da Vinci Code goes, I mean, it is really mixing apples and oranges to say, oh, those early Gnostics, they really had an insight into Jesus. And by the way, Jesus was married. No. Early Gnostic Christians would be breaking out in a rash over the idea of Jesus being married and having sex. Oh, no, we can't go there. And having children, absolutely not. No, that would not be a Gnostic theology.
The Bible makes no claim as to whether Jesus was married or otherwise. But what about the claim that it was customary for most Jews at Jesus' age to be married, especially if they were rabbis?
There are many who would make the claim that all Jewish men had to have been married. Jesus, as a Jew, therefore must have been a husband to someone. But that's a very bad view of history. In the 1st century, Judaism did have celibate groups. The people living at the Dead Sea apparently were not married. We know of a Jewish community in Egypt in which men and women lived celibate lives, joining together for common meals, so that Jesus need not have been married and still yet may well have been, and I think was, a completely faithful Jew.
The overwhelming evidence is that Jesus did not marry, not because he thought anything was wrong with marriage, not because he was afraid of sex or anything like that, but because marriage in that world is not a romantic union between a man and a woman. Marriage is a legal and social arrangement between two families. And it means setting up a household. It means getting involved in worldly things, which for most people was good. But Jesus, with his prophetic vocation, saw that he just didn't have time for that. He didn't have the energy for it. And I think that that's the correct portrayal of Jesus, and we get that in the Gospels.
If he had had one, I suppose someone in the Newer Testament would have written something about that. He would have made declaration about it. He would have made sure that people took care of his wife. At the end, remember, he asked John to take care of his mother, and he asked his mother to take care of John. There was something about a family, filial relationship there. I think if he were married, he would have said, somebody look after the missus.
I think you're my actual father.
What?
I think I'm your daughter.
Who are you? Why are you making these accusations?
I'm not. I'm sorry, this is a mistake.
Wait. Look, if you're going to come into my church and make these accusations, at least tell me who you are.
You should have told me. I shouldn't have had to ask. Why should I have had to ask?
In Dan Brown's storyline, Mary and Jesus had a child, Sarah, whose descendants are still living today and linked to French royal bloodlines. Could there be any truth in this?
I see where the legend could have come from, that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and they had a daughter named Sarah. Because there is a legend that Mary Magdalene and Martha and Lazarus got on a boat and sailed to Marseille in France. They had a servant girl named Sarah. And so I can see from that how, with a little imagination, you then come to the idea that Sarah is not a servant, but she's actually Mary Magdalene's daughter.
I think it finds its appeal because people like conspiracy stories and they like hidden secrets and royalty, but there is no basis in fact to support the suggestion that they were husband and wife and that Jesus left any descendants.
It's theoretically possible that Jesus and Mary were married. Nothing says it wasn't true. On the other hand, absolutely nothing of any historical value says it was true. It is possible that they had children. If so, the bloodline might still exist. But a bloodline that we know about? No. All the evidence that is used to claim that there's a bloodline is based on late legends that have no historical credibility at all.
What about the claim that the figure seated here at Jesus' right is actually Mary Magdalene and not John? Now remember, Dan Brown's plot involves codes hidden by Leonardo da Vinci in his artwork that point to Mary being the real Holy Grail. The art gallery gets so many inquiries about this painting, they run guided tours specifically about the Da Vinci Code.
Anyone can look up a book of Leonardo's sketches and see the preliminary versions he did of the Last Supper before he did the great masterpiece. And he named the people in his preliminary sketches. Now, the person sitting next to Jesus is not named Mary, it's named John or Andrew, depending on which sketch you check.
What I'm told by art historians is that it was very common during the Renaissance to paint young men with feminine features. Traditionally, this has been understood to be the disciple John, the beloved disciple, who allegedly was a young man during Jesus' ministry. And so most art historians think this, in fact, is a portrayal of John. I should point out that if it's not John, then there's a problem. If it's Mary Magdalene, you only have 11 disciples at the Last Supper.
Early church history depicts the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John, John himself according to the church, as young, beardless, unmarried. So it would not be surprising that Da Vinci would have depicted John, who rested on Jesus' breast at the Last Supper, as unbearded, perhaps effeminate.
It's not just in Da Vinci's painting that we see this. It's also in other ancient comparable paintings of the period. Sometimes this figure is closer to Jesus and leaning and reclining on him. Sometimes it's a little further away, but it's clearly the same figure, the red-headed disciple, not a woman at all. So it's a mystery to me why somebody would single out the Da Vinci painting as in some way radically different from these other portrayals of the beloved disciple in a very similar light, and say, well, in this painting, oh, it must be a woman, but in these, well, not so much.
And that brings us to another one of Dan Brown's theories, that Mary herself was the Holy Grail. Well, to explore this, I'm here in Scotland at the magnificent Rosslyn Chapel. This ornate chapel, steeped in symbolism, has long been the source of legends about the Holy Grail. In Dan Brown's story, secret clues located here in Rosslyn Chapel point to the fact that Mary's remains were once held here, along with her lost Gospels.
The idea that Mary Magdalene is the Holy Grail is also without any merit. I think that the Holy Grail, of course, really refers to the cup. I think the traditional understanding of the sharing of a single cup among Jesus' followers really finds far greater support, for example, in the practices of shared communion meals or community meals among Jewish groups in the first century. We need to look at the parallels from Jewish life to understand the significance of a single cup shared among a group of 10 or more disciples, parallels that we find, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the practice of the community at Qumran.
In the Da Vinci Code, sexual rites that celebrate the sacred feminine were described as being part of the Christian lifestyle in Jesus' time. The sacred feminine is the admiration of female power and beauty, just like ancient fertility rites.
Certainly many ancient religions had goddesses, had aspects of fertility in their cults, which we really don't know much about. Sometimes we have the language and we're really not sure what those fertility cults did, though certainly some cults had sacred prostitutes, both male and female. But again, in those fertility cults, it was the sacredness of sex that was being celebrated.
Sexuality is a site of incredible beauty and power, but just because it's that, it can also be a site of incredible abuse and incredible violence. And unfortunately, what often happens in situations where sex is simply seen as a means of gratifying the self rather than respect and engagement with another in a love relationship, it can be extremely abusive. And so the church, rather than seeing in wild pagan sort of ceremonies these forms of abuse that were taking place, they rather focused on physical arousal and thought that itself is bad. Physical arousal is not bad, that's how God made us.
But the important thing to understand is in the 2nd, 3rd and 4th century, there was a steady decline in the way early Christians evaluated sexuality until you get to the 4th century and the 5th century, where it's pretty well taken for granted that celibacy is better. And if you want to truly live a spiritual life, celibacy's on. It's a mixture, and it's puzzling because in some cases, many people found that immensely liberating. Particularly women found it immensely liberating. Sexual celibacy, not what the divine feminine people would have led you to expect, because being celibate freed women from an endless round of childbearing, breastfeeding and raising babies. If a young woman was capable, competent and ambitious, if she was a wife and mother, she had nothing. If she was an abbess, she might end up running a monastery with hundreds of people, and that's real management skills needed there.
Personally, as a woman, when I read the Da Vinci Code, I was disappointed that the answer ended up being a fertility cult of the woman goddess. That, again, classifies woman based on her biology and not on the fact that intellectually and spiritually she is co-created with man in God's image. So it's a disappointment to me to think that the great answer is some type of hidden, spring rite fertility cult taking place, because I'd rather be accepted because of my uniqueness as a woman, but also because I share intellectually and spiritually and psychologically gifts that are part of the unique identity that God has given me.
I find this an unfortunate connection because, in effect, Mary Magdalene gets reduced to being Mrs. Jesus. I'd much rather look to the history of women in the Gospels and reclaim the actuality of their lives rather than have to invent something.
To say that Christians are anti-sex or Christians have a negative view of sexuality is perhaps historically accurate, but is essentially theologically misinformed. It's simply not true that the Bible has a negative view of sex.
Putting aside the fictional aspects of Dan Brown's novel, has he accidentally hit on women's frustrations at being disempowered by the traditional church? Perhaps the real appeal of the Da Vinci Code for women is that it's challenging the church and its patriarchy. So, does the traditional church have a case to answer about its treatment of women?
I think that the Da Vinci Code is a misinterpretation of the significant role that women played in the earliest generations of the church. But I do think that as church history progressed, there was a gradual suppression of women's roles in church as well, and that's one of the reasons that it appeals to people today. I think that there have been some difficult moments in church history in that the wonderful relationship that Jesus had with women and that even Paul had with women gradually was lost over the years. I think that there's an opportunity in our era to welcome once again the contributions of women to ministry, and we see that in ministry we need both male and female because both are created in the image of God to really touch lives, to be able to bring healing and understanding, to teach, to minister. This is something that God has invested in both man and woman.
Many men and women today believe that historically women have been given a raw deal by the church. As society's changed, has the church kept up with women's changing roles today? If not, what does it tell us about the future of the church?
Traditional scholarship in the New Testament has sort of neglected in a very deep way how important the role of women was in Jesus' ministry and also in the ministry of Paul. And so by highlighting that issue, the Da Vinci Code immediately attracts more than 50% of the readers of the English language world, who are women.
And I've studied this a great deal, this whole question of the treatment of women in the early church. I don't find a conspiracy. I don't find a definite pattern. I find in and out, up and down. It's individual decisions, it's particular attitudes. There are times and places in which the role of women is well respected. There are others when it is not, and there is some blatant misogynism. There's no question about that. I don't find it to be greater than what was present in the society at large. So I don't find that Christianity either particularly liberated women nor particularly oppressed women. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't plenty of oppression going on and some liberation.
In the first century, we're dealing with strongly patriarchal societies in which male authority, of course, is dominant. And so it's just a very gradual deterioration in women's roles in the church.
I can certainly understand why women would feel as if the church has suppressed them. But on the other hand, the New Testament itself, the Old Testament, the history of the church also records women's proactive contributions to the church.
So I think that if the Da Vinci Code helps to act as a catalyst for discussion about the roles and contribution of women in the church today, it will have brought about a very important dialogue.
Well, we've learnt that Jesus pioneered the role of women. In fact, they played a significant part in the ministry of Jesus and continued to do so even after the resurrection. In the beginning, God made man and woman in his own image as equals. And although history may show that from time to time the church has oppressed women, Jesus' own action shows that he believed that women were to play a very significant part in the future of the church.
We have to be careful not to take Dan Brown's fictional notions too seriously. After all, he is a novelist, not a historian. But we can certainly ask why his novel has hit such a chord, especially with women. And clearly, female readers are fascinated by the idea that Mary was more powerful and more important than previously thought, and that the church had suppressed Mary's true role. Despite the confusion that may have been caused, the success of the Da Vinci Code presents an exciting opportunity to learn more about both Mary Magdalene and the role of women in the church.